Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm Regina Gill, the founder and executive director of the Gold Coast Art Center and the Gold Coast International Film Festival. Hooray, hooray, thank you. Happy to see you all turn out. We did have a change of date and a change of time, which kind of threw me, because I'm a creature of habit and was ready to show up here at 7:30. Thank God I have keepers. So welcome, and I'm happy to see you. You're going to have an amazing experience. It's going to be something you're going to share with your friends, and you're going to tell them, wow, what you missed. So let me start by telling you that you are here for the Long Island premiere of How to Build a Time Machine. That's okay. It's okay, we're starting early. We're happy you're here. Tonight's program is discussing time travel theory. Where would you go? Somebody asked me that today. Said, if you had the chance to get into a time machine, where would you go? Back? How far back? Forward? It's interesting. So something to ponder. Tonight's program is presented as part of the National Evening of Science on Screen, where theaters nationwide present unique programming, pairing a current, classic, cult, or documentary film with a lively introduction by a notable figure from the world of science, technology, or medicine. Science on Screen is an initiative of the Coolidge Corner Theater with major support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Hi guys, you're going to love this. And the Gold Coast Film Festival. Here at the cinema, we are absolutely delighted and proud that we are the only venue on Long Island participating in this nationwide event. So hooray for us. Our guest speakers, and they are quite remarkable, are, if you would stand up when I introduce you, or shake a wave or something like that. Our guest speakers are the director, Jay Cheel. Jay, there he is. And the subjects of the film, Time Travelers, artist-animator Robert Niosi, and Dr. Ronald Mallett, author of the book, here he is, Time Travel, a Scientist's Personal Mission to Make Time Travel a Reality. That's cool. Here's something. Following the screening, the bathrooms will wait. Don't run. In the lobby, following the screening and the Q&A, you will have the opportunity to get a copy of Dr. Mallett's book, and he will be on hand for the book signing and for any other additional golly gee questions you might have after seeing the film. Brian Gordon here is our senior programmer who finds us these remarkable films, and I believe he deserves a round of applause. Okay, now. Thank you to our sponsors, because in addition to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, we have our usual suspects, Eileen and Alan Saroff, and we are very, very pleased for everybody who's always understood that the Art Center is a not-for-profit and needs grassroots community support. By turning out, you are demonstrating your support, and that's all that we need. So thank you very much. Thank you to our volunteers. Volunteers, raise your, well, you've seen them. Volunteers, raise your hand. Volunteers give us, this is good, volunteers give us the most precious commodity. They give us their time. There you go, there's a good plug. And last but not least, if you have one of these, I just spent the entire day negotiating this with a teenager. Step away from the device. So just turn it off and forget about it and pretend you've taken time travel back to 1954. Okay, so thank you all. I'm turning the mic over to Brian Gordon. Brian.
Thank you very much, Regina. Well, just a brief introduction to How to Build a Time Machine. Like any very good documentary, and hopefully like all the ones that we present here at the Gold Coast Cinema Series and at the festival, the film is much more than what the subject matter is. So if this film is certainly extraordinarily interesting enough about time travel and how to build a time machine, this film is also about obsession, about loss, memory, random events, and kind of a connection to time, which I think for many of us is kind of like the, how shall I put it? It's the something you really can't change. And this film poses the question, well, maybe you can. So you're in for a very fascinating film. You'll certainly get to know Mr. Niosi and Mr. Mallet much better at the end of the film, and I guess through the craft of the filmmaking, Jay Teal as well. So please stick around for what will be a very interesting discussion. And just another reminder about making sure your phones are off. God, there's so much addressed in this film to think about, but the thing that, being somewhat around your age myself and seeing the time machine back in the early 60s, to me was struck was, you know, when the time that, how important or how significant was it the time that you saw the time machine or either saw the film or read it? You were, Ronald, you were 11?
Yes, sir.
And just coming over, just, you know, recovering from the tragedy in your life, and then you'd seen it when you were 7?
7 years.
Yeah. How important, how significant was that, and just having it, you know, affect your life, and just in the way it did, whether it was to, you know, oh, thank you, to build a time machine or to, you know, or just to pursue. I mean, if that had happened, say, a few years later in your teens, do you think that would have affected you in the same way?
I believe that it would have, but the thing is that what was important was the fact that it did happen at the age that I think it's very relevant what you said. It happened at the age of when I was 11. At that age, fantasy and reality blend together. And so for me, when and it was the book that originally inspired me. That's when I first, you know, came across the notion. And the thing is that, but even though that sparked me, you know, my imagination, and I did try to put something together that looked like the cover. One of the things that was key, and really key, was it said at the beginning, scientific people know very well. So when I found that the device that I put together didn't work, and it probably was just as well when I plugged it in that didn't, it probably would have burned the house down, was the fact that I was disappointed but not discouraged, because I knew that maybe if it said scientific people, that I was going to have to in some way learn science in order to do that. So that was another piece that was extremely important, and I didn't know exactly at 11 what that meant. It was actually later, when I was about 12 or 13, that I came across a book in the Salvation Army. So I should mention that after my father died, the family plunged into poverty. And I don't know how my poor mother did it, because when he died, she was only 30 with 4 kids, and I was the oldest. Somehow she put it together. And this was a time when African-American women had a hard time getting a job, even though she had high school education. She was a maid, and we used government subsidies in order to you know, get by. But the thing is that I had a very strong book habit. I mean, literally, I had to read. I had to devour books. And fortunately, at the Salvation Army, for a nickel, you could get books. So I hung out there all the time. In fact, I was using the money that my mother would give me for lunch money to do it. And I actually became ill because I was buying books rather than eating. The thing is that seeing this book with a picture of Einstein next to an hourglass, that's the thing that caught me. Once again, it was an image. When I went in there, this paperback had a picture of Einstein next to a large hourglass. So it said to my mind, I knew that this Einstein was a great genius of some sort, but it said to me that Einstein had something to do with time. And so I wanted to know what that was. And it was a long, long, long journey. But that was the beginning of it. So and one of the things that I think was important about the movie on all levels was this connection of art and science. You know, one of my favorite quotes by Einstein is that imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited, but imagination encircles the world. Now, what Einstein meant by that was not that knowledge was not important. What he meant was that it's our imagination, that our curiosity is another word for saying that allows us to want to acquire the knowledge. And so it's the art. It was H.G. Wells's book, which is Art, that had inspired me to want to acquire the scientific knowledge to do what I did. And that was the beginning. But one of the other things I want to point out about that I really appreciated was Jay's use of music. Yeah. In the thing. I mean, it's brilliant, the way that he uses music.
Any way you work in Bob Dylan is find by my book.
And one of the things that I really loved, which I didn't know that he was going to choose for the tune. Remember, there was a scene in which I imagined going back into the past and seeing my father again. Well, that's a movement from Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. But that was, particularly that symphony was one of my father's. He loved classical music. And so I never mentioned that specifically to Jay. So for him to have chosen that piece was, was something else. And I think that Rob had sort of the same sort of experience with the piece.
Is this working? Yeah, I did. I hadn't discussed this with Jay at all, but the piece of music, it was from The Ring of the Nibelung. When I'm painting the dish, it's the opening of this expansive opera. I used to listen to that all the time when I was painting. And so when I'm sitting there watching this film for the first time and I hear this music, it's like, how would Jay know that? It's a little bit scary.
A little louder to the mic.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. That's it. I'm done.
Well, just going back to my original question, I mean, was that at a time when you were 7, it was just like this vulnerability or this innocence and just,
Well, I don't know if it's vulnerability or innocence. It was the excitement of seeing this film. It just pressed a lot of buttons for me, rockets, dinosaurs, time travel, 7-year-old boy. I think you could see the connection there. And also it was just an incredible evening with my siblings and my dad, watching the film and then coming home in the car all excited about this concept of time travel, which of course was the first time I had heard about anything like that or thought about anything like that. So it was just very exciting, and it was one of the films that I believe inspired me to get involved in filmmaking. There were a number of them at that time that were pretty exciting. Journey to the Center of the Earth, which is from the novel by Jules Verne. But The Time Machine was probably the most influential for me at that moment. It really did direct me, and I got involved in filmmaking.
Jay, how did you end up pairing the two? Talk about that process.
Well, I originally approached Rob in 2005 now, right? I did a student film on the same subject matter, and decided years later when I felt maybe my filmmaking abilities had improved a little bit and wanted to catch up with Rob, see where his machine was at. He was still working on it 7 years later or whatever it was. Started documenting that process and then reached out to Ron, and Ron was into it. So it was, there was another element to the film that I ended up getting rid of, but it kind of brought together these two guys in this way that I felt they really complemented each other, and it was a lot more sincere than I thought originally. I don't think I'm a sincere person, not by default though. But the film, it started seeing something that felt like it could be a little more romantic and heartfelt and intimate, and so it went from there.
Can I say something about that?
Of course.
Thank you. I wasn't asking you. Documentary filmmaking, I worked on a lot of stuff that was very scripted, commercials and animation, where you know almost every single frame of film you're going to be shooting. But with a documentary film, you go in with an idea, and then the universe takes over. And the day you're shooting, it rains or somebody doesn't show up, and the film suddenly takes a different direction. And the brilliance of a documentary filmmaker is being able to recognize opportunities as things change. And you could see Jay has that ability. He really recognized what was going on between me and Ron and pulled it all together. And I had no idea while we were filming what the result would be. And I couldn't be happier.
Yeah.
Just to comment on that, during the party, I don't know if you remember the Time Machine reveal, I believe a toilet overflowed in your house, and I was faced with this decision: do we cover the toilet overflowing or do we stick with the party? And we did not cover the toilet overflowing.
Did anybody really need to see the toilet thing? No.
I liked how you bookended the film with the part in Ireland. Where did you, at what point in making the film did you come up with the idea to do that, and why did you choose say ritual or the event in Ireland?
Well, it actually had to do with the original third part of the film, which was surrounding a kind of a more conspiracy theory, supposed real-life time traveler. And I went to Ireland because that was the Newgrange Monument, and it was the winter solstice in 2012. And because of the certain predictions that this time traveler supposedly made, it was tapping into that. Once that was gone, I had this footage and went all the way to Ireland by myself and shot it, and I need to use it somehow, and set it aside, and then realized that there was this nice sort of bookend of people gathering to kind of witness the reveal of a monument that, as Rob said, he plans for it to go through time for 200 years. So you can imagine people 200 years from now getting into Rob's backyard in his memory and surrounding the monument. And I just also like the idea. It's funny, we did a test screening, and that divided the audience in terms of why it's there and if it should be there, which I think kind of made me think, yeah, I want it there now, because it just is kind of a weird, sort of provocative, moody opening, and it reminds me of The Exorcist, which opens in Iraq, and there's this weird sort of vibe to it, and it sets a tone, and I think for me that's a big part of it, is setting tone. So, but it is there for a purpose. It's not pretentious at all.
Oh, not at all. I don't think that at all.
Yeah.
Ron, going back to what you said earlier about quoting Einstein about imagination before knowledge, if you will, I think about movies, and you think about, I think George Powell, who directed War of the Worlds Time Machine and War of the Worlds, and of course I think he did a film about a trip to the moon, and of course that science fiction became reality with the moon landing, and we've looked at that TV show that says Space: The Final Frontier. Well, now with this film, I'm thinking the final frontier is probably time travel.
Yeah,
and how close are we, or how far away are we?
Well, as I mentioned in the movie, the scientific basis of time travel is based on Einstein's work. And I tell people, you hear a lot of things out there, and I say the rule of thumb that you should use is the person who's talking about this basing their work on some real scientific basis. And the real scientific basis for time travel is Einstein's theories of relativity. Why? Because the fact that, as I mentioned there, he had two theories. One was called the special theory of relativity, and to put it once again in a nutshell, what he said was that time slows down the faster you move. Okay? And for instance, your heart is a clock. That means the faster that you move, the more your heart rate would slow down. Now, you wouldn't notice this. This is something that's actually happening to you. Someone who was watching you would see it. It's just like in your car. You're traveling 60, 65 miles an hour. You don't feel that, but you see a person zooming by you. And the thing is that real experiments have been done to show that time really does slow down. Subatomic particles that can normally live for just fractions of a second, we can get them to live 10, 20 times longer by speeding them up close to the speed of light. If we do that in terms of human beings, and I should mention, NASA is looking at rockets that eventually can travel close to the speed of light. Some of them have exotic names like ion engines. And when we have these, the same thing will happen for human beings. The person who's traveling in that rocket will age less than the person who's on the ground. And once again, we've seen that. So this is real. This is just, we're taking the baby steps as far as human scale, but it's real. Traveling to the past is another matter, but that's still also based on Einstein's theory. It's his general theory of relativity. And I didn't emphasize that as much in the film. We only have a certain limited amount of time. But Einstein's general theory of relativity says that, in a nutshell, that gravity can affect time. Gravity can cause time to slow down. What that means is that gravity here at the surface of the Earth, where gravity's strong, clocks are actually running slower than clocks at a high altitude, where gravity is weak. And you might say, wait a minute, has that been shown? Has that been proven? Not only that, but what I find is that most audiences aren't aware, not only has it been shown, but it's actually part of your everyday life. I actually used it to find my way down here today. It's the GPS. The GPS in your unit, in your car, it has a clock. And the satellites that send the signal, the way it works is that there's 24 satellites above us, that 12,000 miles above us, that are sending signals down. And they have a clock on them, and your unit has a clock. When the engineers were first setting up the system, they were using Newton's theory of time. And Newton's theory of time says nothing can affect time. So according to Newton, the clocks on board those satellites are running at exactly the same rate as the clock in your unit. And when they first set up the GPS system, which was based on Newton's ideas of time, it was giving incorrect locations all over the place. This was real. What they had to do was consult with the physicists, and the physicist said, even though it's a small effect, it's significant. And it turns out that the unit in your car is actually running slower than the units on board the satellites. This is real. So they actually have to use Einstein's theory of time and how gravity affects it. They use a computer to calibrate that difference. So this is real. Gravity can affect time, and as I said, it's part of our everyday life, and we don't even realize that. So that's what my work is actually based on, is actually using Einstein's theory of gravity and how it can affect time. And I won't have all the time to go into it, here. One other thing that I do want to mention that cuts across all the things that were mentioned was, you remember that there was that heartbreaking scene about Rob's friend, and being able, what sort of thing could have affected, if I had changed this, if this had changed, okay? That's one of the aspects of time travel, going back to the past, that is very intriguing but also problematic. And what wasn't mentioned in the film is this, it mentions about the paradox. If you go back and, for example, prevent your grandparents from meeting each other, then they don't have your parents, and if they don't have your parents, then your parents don't have you, so how were you able to go back? Science actually has a way of getting around that particular paradox, and it's called quantum theory, quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is part of our life. Without quantum mechanics, we wouldn't have our cell phones, our personal computers, we wouldn't even know how the atom works. It turns out that quantum mechanics leads to a way out of that notion of a paradox. And just to give you a little bit of a taste of that, how it does that, according to quantum mechanics, there was a physicist back in 1957 at Princeton. He developed a theory that was called the many worlds interpretation of the universe. We know it more popularly as the parallel universe theory. What the parallel universe theory says, to give you a very simple example, suppose this evening at dinner you are looking at a menu and you saw item A and item B on the menu, and you were trying to make up your mind. So you decide to choose item B. According to, his name was Hugh Everett III, by the way, this physicist. According to Everett, there would be a split of the universe. There would now be a separate universe in which you have chosen item A. They don't know about each other. In other words, there's a universe in which you actually have chosen item A, and there's another separate universe in which you've chosen item B. And this is completely consistent with quantum mechanics. And the thing is that there was another physicist many years later, his name is David Deutsch at Oxford University, and he applied this idea to time travel. And what he realized, working it out mathematically, is that when you travel back in time, the moment you arrive in the past, there's a split of the universe. You arrive in a parallel universe in which you could prevent your grandparents from meeting each other. But there's no paradox there because you were never born in that universe in the first place. So you would still exist, but there would never be a you in that universe. But remember, I said there was a split of the universe. You do not arrive in the other universe. That other universe is the one that gave rise to your grandparents meeting each other, having your parents, and having you. So the upshot is that you can go back into the past, but the past you arrive in is not the past that you came from. That's just to give you a little bit of a taste of what quantum mechanics has to say about these sort of things.
There's a movie script in there somewhere. Okay, questions? Yes, sir. Back.
The paradox you're talking about, where you're going to a separate timeline, that was proven, I think, with quantum mechanics and at a university. We saw it on a show where they show electrons existing in each of its states at the same time. And that was one of the basis of proofs, I believe, for that concept.
Yeah. Well, what that does is it shows it's consistent with. But, you know, time travel wasn't involved with that, okay? But what it was showing was is that Everett's notion is consistent with that possibility. But whether or not this is the way in which things would work as far as time travel is concerned, that hasn't been shown yet. Okay? But yes, that shows that it's consistent with that notion.
We have a question?
Yes, assuming that there was another universe that had made a time machine 100 years ago, 200 years ago, so that is out of the way, how does the fact that time is warped affect what you would want to do when you go back to change things?
Okay, that's a very good question. The thing is that normally time travels in a linear fashion, and even in a special theory of relativity, time flows from the past, present, to the future. The thing is that in Einstein's theory, and unfortunately I don't have the time to go into all the details of that. I do in the book, by the way. It turns out that you can use that gravity is actually a twisting, a bending of space, and if you bend space, you can actually bend time. Okay? And so that bending of time, I mean, normally if you think of time as going from the past, present, to the future along a straight line, if I take, in fact, you could do this with a strip of paper. When I've given talks at schools, I do that. If you draw a timeline, and at the bottom of the line you have the past, in the middle of the line you have the present, and the top of the line you have the future. All of us live our lives according to that timeline. We're unaware of it. But now let's suppose I have a way of twisting space. I could actually twist, and that's in Einstein's theory that you can do that. And if you could twist space, you could actually twist that line into a loop. And now imagine I've made that line into a loop. I can go from the past, continue along to the present, and then continue along to the future. But remember, I've made time into a loop. So I can do now what? I can go from the future back to the past. Okay? Mm-hmm.
Okay, coming your way.
Just on a lighter note, being enthusiastic about time travel and watching the same time machine movies you saw, what are some of your favorite ones?
Okay, well, the top of the list, of course, is the Time Machine. Okay? But one of the ones that's a favorite of mine, but unfortunately, because of its title, I don't think it gets as much press as that it should. And it's with Claude Van Damme. It's called Timecop. You know, that's another one of my favorites. And the reason why it is because it brings up one of the things that I just talked on a little bit, and that is the fact that when time travel to the past becomes possible, we are going to have to regulate it, just like we have air travel, you know, regulations. And this movie postulates a future in which time travel is possible, so you have a time travel enforcement agency. And their job is to make sure what they do is they actually see, they can actually see a ripple happening from something in the past that hasn't gotten to us yet. They're able to see that potential ripple, and so they go back to the past, and they actually get the person who's trying to, a time traveler who's gone back, and is trying to do something in the past. And of course, and I won't give you anything about the story, except that's the general thing. But one of the beautiful things about the thing is the paradox that one of the time enforcement officers, which is Claude Van Damme, his wife had been murdered in the past. So what do? It's intriguing. So if you get a chance to see it, it's really well done movie, Timecop. But those are the top two of mine.
Rob? Yes,
you know, somebody compiled a list of all the time travel films. I don't remember the number, but it's astronomical. Time travel, I think, also reached the peak about 2 years ago to a more time travel TV series, like in one season than ever before. Looper is one. Was that Looper, right? With Bruce Willis was one that I thought was really interesting and intriguing. There was another one called Frequency, which I also enjoyed. I mean, there's a long list, and I do find myself gravitating toward any film that seems to have something to do with time travel concept, and I think many people do. That accounts for how many there have been made. How about you, Jay?
There's a film called Primer, which I like a lot. Right. There's a fun one called Time Crimes, which is great. And of course, Terminator and Back to the Future and all of the usual choices as well. Timecop rocks.
Time Tunnel, anyone?
Time Tunnel. How about you, Brian?
Oh.
Time Tunnel?
No, a TV show. Well, I love The Time Machine. It's still my favorite. And something else, not quite the same, but Peggy Sue Got Married, where it's sort of, I like that one too. Yeah.
Okay.
Karen.
So many questions, but I do want to ask you about the physics, the science. And
I'll handle this, Ron.
so when you describe this impact and the change in the clocks and so forth from space and so forth, so two questions that came to my mind.
Sure.
Number one, the distance that the Einstein and the black holes and so forth would have to be, is far. And like you're saying, the space of traveling at light years before you really get these impacts. But also, as you were talking, it occurred to me, your heart and the watch and all of these things are machines. And time is actually what we designate. We created a mathematical concept.
Yeah.
So machines, and I don't know physics, but it seems to me that the physical forces, gravity and so forth, act differently at different altitudes and speeds and so forth and that. So that's where it hurts my head that I can't conceive of an actual relativity in that.
Yeah. Well, let me, because this question comes up a lot, by the way. It's a very good question. The thing is that you have to remember that you're quite right in the sense that how we perceive time, that's called there is a mechanical element. That is to say that's called time measurement. Okay? Time measurement, however, is something different from time duration. To give you an example, the thing that you have to remember is the fact that there's a psychological element associated with time. Okay? In other words, we perceive time differently depending on what our mood is and depending on, whatever. But there's time that's independent of us. And what do I mean by independent of us? There's a natural universal clock that began at the Big Bang before any of us existed. That is not a man-made concept. That's when time began. In Einstein's theory, prior to the Big Bang, there was no space and there was no time. A lot of people think of the Big Bang, they still think of the Big Bang as something that happens in space. The Big Bang is not something that happens in space. The Big Bang is space itself happening. And space, that's the reason why it's called space-time, is you can't have one without the other. So prior to the Big Bang, it's hard to imagine what we mean by prior because there's no time, but there's no space, no time. At the Big Bang is when you might say the universal clock starts. And that's prior to any measurement. In other words, the universe evolved. And that's independent of the way in which we measure that evolution. So you have to separate out the two. There is the evolution of the universe, and then there's the measurement of that evolution. In other words, the distance between here and there is independent of how I measure it. But if I want to know how far this is from here to there, I have to get a ruler. Okay? So time is the same thing. Time is something that is not something that was created by us. We didn't create the Big Bang. Time is something that happened at the Big Bang, and the universe has evolved. Eventually, when we came along, we decided that we had to find a way of measuring this because we had to worry about our crops, we had to worry about, the seasons and things like that. So those are two separate things, okay? Duration, evolution, I'm saying. And by evolution, I'm not talking about, Darwin. But duration and measurement of that duration.
We have a question here.
I so wish that I understood all of this. I should have listened better in my science class. Simple question. Do you have your machine insured? Was it difficult finding a company to insure it?
Yeah, here's the other aspect. In physics, unlike other areas of science, for instance, like chemistry and biology, theory and experiment work together. In physics, there is a very, very much of a division of labor. There's theoretical physics and experimental physics. Einstein was a theoretical physicist. He did not develop nuclear reactors or the atomic bomb. What he did was what a theoretical physicist is, not just Einstein, but anything, they use mathematics to try to describe how the universe works. Experimental physicists try to actually do experiments to see whether those theories are true. To give you a simple example, just the Nobel Prize that was just won last year. Einstein had it predicted mathematically the existence of gravitational waves over 100 years ago. But we didn't have the technology until recently, in other words, the experimental technology, to actually show that Einstein's theory about gravitational waves was correct. Now, the reason why I'm saying that this is important, because, and I'm going to relate it back to my work, is the cost to Einstein in developing his general theory of relativity, his theory of gravity, which predicted gravity waves, was mental energy. All it cost him was the chalk and pencils and a lot of mental energy, okay, to create the equations. The cost for the experiment, and this gets to people because it sounds simple, you know, we have gravity wave. The cost of the experiment was $1,100,000,000. That shows you the difference between theoretical physics and experimental physics. Now, coming back to my work, which I mentioned, I'm a theoretical physicist. What I was able to show was I solved Einstein's gravitational equations to show that light can manipulate time. And this was published in the standard peer-reviewed journals and so on. But these are equations. I actually have an experimental partner. His name is Chandra Chowdhury, who's a laser specialist. He's not a specialist in relativity, but he's a specialist in lasers. And he's trying to get the funding to actually prove my work, just to do a feasibility study, and as I said, put it in perspective with how much the gravity waves cost. And by feasibility study, I'm talking about computer modeling and things like that. It's $250,000. That's chump change compared to the gravitational wave. But to get the money to do that is very hard. And the thing is that people say, well, why don't you do crowdfunding, and this sort. People expect things to happen like that. And if you say, well, I want funding, to do it, they're expecting it to happen, and it took 10 years for the gravitational wave experiments. So that's the problem. The problem is that we don't have a device. What we have are equations, and that device that you see is actually a demonstration conception of what it would look like. To do the real experiment is going to cost millions of dollars. And so sometimes when people ask me, so when is the time machine going to be ready? I say, well, as soon as you give me the money to do it. I mean, but that's a sad, fact, is just that real scientific experiments are very, and the Large Hadron Collider, which is this particle accelerator, that costs $10 billion to do. So the difference between the theories that led to these devices and doing the experiments, that's the holdup. So we're trying to get the funding, but we have the theory there, but we just don't have the funding.
Rob, is your machine insured?
No, I was just going to say, everybody here should pony up. I mean, if we're going to do this. No, my machine is not insured. Wow, I never thought about that. Okay, nobody's coming over then. No, actually, you're all invited. Seriously.
Where
I'm
is
in
it
Westchester.
located?
I'm in Briarcliff Manor.
Okay, that's close
Come
enough.
by and take a ride.
We have a question behind this lady. I got it.
Okay. My first question is, Mr. Millett, how do you feel about, they say that as you get older, time speeds up.
Oh,
Is that
Yeah.
true?
Oh, I see. Yeah. No. The thing is that. Yeah. Go ahead.
Is that true?
No. Yes, in the sense of physiological. Remember, I said there's two different types of time we're talking about. There is physical time, which started at the Big Bang, and no, that doesn't change at all. That's moving independent of us. But how you're a biological device, and that your perception of that changes according to the accumulation of information that you've acquired over a lifetime, and how busy you are. All of these things affect time, and whether you're feeling good or bad, but that is physiological time. And yes, physiological time does alter, but that does not alter physical time. So the two are happening separately. Physical time is happening independent of what's happening physiological. So I'm sorry, physical time is happening independent. Physiological time is happening for us personally. So two people are sitting and watching the same show. For one, it seems like time has passed for it just like that. Another one who's watching and said, geez, when is this going to end, And the thing is that, people have been, I've been to faculty meetings in which, I think is this going to end forever? The thing is that that's physiological, okay? And as I said, that's separate. So yes, physiological time is altering for you, but physical time is not.
Okay, hold on one sec. You just had your question, 1 second. We have talked a lot about the science. Now I want to talk about the art for a moment. So I don't know if your questions pertain to the making of the film or the making of the machine or well, we heard about inspirations, but what about, sorry?
Robert, what your wife felt about you spending all that time and money, and also, Ron, did you ever decide to have a family?
Personal questions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, as the movie pointed out, that I'll have to answer this in two ways. One is that my scientific life played havoc with my personal life, right? I'm on my third marriage, which tells you how much of a, how much it's done. And I have no children by any of those marriages. Because, as I said, eventually I realized that it was going to be an illusion for me to think. I really was. In fact, I didn't know that Jay was going to include that part, because that was actually a very personal statement I made. So when it was in the movie, and of course he didn't allow us to see what was going to be.
Signed the release. Signed the release.
When I made that statement, it's the kind of statement that I would have made to my therapist, which is the fact that I really came to the realization that I would have expected my child to feel about me in the same way I felt about my father. And when that disappointment, which is likely, because circumstances are different, it may turn out, but it may not, that I would be disappointed and crushed. So what I have to do is just live with what that special relationship was. Now, I should mention that in the marriages I had stepchildren, and they turned out good. In fact, my wives have said that some of them have decided to become teachers because of me. So I feel like I've been a good parent. But as I said, I realized that to try to expect the same sort of relationship between me and my child was not realistic.
You asked about how my wife felt about the whole thing. No comment. No, actually, Sally was great. I think when I started the project, she didn't quite understand what I was doing, but then again, neither did I. My two children, I have daughters who are now 18 and 20, and they barely remember life prior to time machine construction. And I'm sure there was a point where they thought like every dad was building a time machine at home. So they were, they were like, yeah, my dad's building a time machine. Hey, their friends would come over, and I'd say, hey, you want to bring your friends to see the machine? No, that's okay. They don't need it. Their dads are probably building one. But no, Sally was extremely supportive, and when she got to see parts coming together and what they looked like and the colors and the shapes and how things were moving, I think she found it really interesting and inspiring as well. And that's the best you could hope for when you're building something like that.
What are you working on now?
Well, I've started collecting parts for the next project, which is also based on a Wells novel. It was First Men in the Moon. This guy, it was just after, he wrote it just after helium had been discovered, and he came up with the idea of an anti-gravity paste. And in his novel, it's the application is they build a spaceship, and they go to the moon. And it was made into a film in 1964. Yeah. It's actually a more ambitious project because it's about 12 feet in diameter. I'd have to build it outside. But I'm shooting for the moon.
Okay. How much did the space program and Sputnik?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is that because of our age difference, it would affect us differently. Because, and that, in fact, is one of the things that I didn't point out. In fact, I did in the movie. But one of the things is that you have to remember that Sputnik happened in what, '57, and the thing is that people were still. The notion of going to the moon was, you know, people thought. In fact, the science fiction sections in the drugstores were kept where the adult books were area because because reading science fiction, I mean, people thought there's something really weird about this person, so for me that's one of the reasons why I kept it a secret, because I knew that people were already worried about me, that I had been a nice happy kid. Now I was very depressed, and I knew that if I told them that I wanted to build a time machine, I was a student enough even at that age to realize that this was not going to be good. So I kept it as a secret. So it didn't influence me that much. The thing that influenced me literally was the magazine, The Time Machine, because the thing is that as far as I was concerned, that was something that was, just, out there. And so it didn't influence me. I mean, it was, but as I said later on, that would have had an impact.
Was the move, did the Time Machine have any relationship to the space program at all? Or
no, because, H.G. Wells wrote the book in 1895, okay? So that had no bearing whatsoever on it, okay? And so for me, there was no, as I said, the only thing that for me was a disconnect was the fact that people were so skeptical about space flight that I didn't even want to, go there as far as a time machine was concerned.
Well, I think as a species, we were probably inspired and excited about watching a man walk on the moon for the first time. I remember that moment sitting in front of the TV. And I'm going to get off topic here a little bit. I'm a little disappointed that we're not, continuing that. I mean, NASA and that space program created so many new technologies, including the one that's in your pocket that you go onto Facebook with and all that sort of stuff. So much of the stuff came out of the space program, from Velcro to visco foam mattresses, created industries all over the world, employed literally hundreds of millions of people. Why aren't we doing that anymore? That's what we should be investing in technology and time machines.
Okay, we are going to move this down to the book signing in the lobby.
I should mention a moment about the book signing, because people ask me, will I understand? That's the very first one. Yes, it was written it's specifically written as a popular level book, okay? But it's not written as your pure science book. That's another thing I wanted. It's a memoir with the science in it. Because what I wanted to do was to have people on a journey that I was on. I did not want them to fall asleep. I wanted them to, and so I actually talk about more than just my work. I talk about black holes, wormholes, and other work that other people are doing. But I also talk about what it's like growing up in a very difficult time. So it's like what Clint Eastwood said. It talks about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's real, but it does give a lot of science in there, too.
Yeah, completely documentary style. So it basically, I'll do interviews, so long interviews, start there, kind of do like a what I guess you would call a radio edit, where it's sort of trying to find the structure based on the interviews that I've done, and then alongside Rob's sort of process stuff, which I knew I was going to film from the beginning, looking at the interviews and trying to figure out visual ways to kind of support that material so it's not just talking heads the whole time. So, you know, luckily with Rob, he's a good self-documenter. He has a lot of materials that he's saved over the years, pictures, films, stuff like that that I could use and kind of help that to tell his story.
Yes, you alluded to the toilet.
Right.
What they did. Was there one or two things that were surprising about the process, or the opposite that may have gone easier than you thought? What was, you know, what got in the way of your story, and what was surprisingly?
Right. I think there was nothing that got in the way, but definitely the fact that Rob it took him so long to build the time machine, and I started at a point where, you know, I knew it had to be finished within the body of the film, but I didn't want to rush him because he'd been working on it for so long. So patiently waiting and seeing it coming together and seeing it getting closer and closer and closer. It wasn't a challenge, but it took time. I just had to kind of wait for it to happen. And then the edit was challenging because it's not a traditional narrative. It's kind of a character study, and there's two men, both building time machines, but one's physical and one isn't. So one is like completely on paper, one is a tangible physical object. One person is active, one is inactive. So finding a balance where they can kind of fill in each other's strengths and weaknesses in that regard.
I understand completely. You did a fantastic job.
Thank you.
Regarding that time period at the film, what was the total amount of time from first shoot?
We started the summer of 2011 and finished spring 2016. So it was 5 years in total. So I shot it over around 4.5 and edited throughout that process, finished it in 2016, and our premiere was in the spring.
What are plans for the film in the future, or what would you like to see?
We're kind of at the tail end of everything. It's played a bunch of festivals. It's available on iTunes. It's streaming on Hulu, Amazon, all of that stuff. There's a limited Blu-ray release, and I think there's supposed to be a DVD release at some point. So that's the plan.
Last question: what are you most proud of throughout the entire process with everybody all together?
I think I'm proud of the film, but the fact that getting the chance to make these films and hang out with these guys and forming real relationships with them, and I'm spending a week here and I'm staying at Rob's house, so it's a great opportunity to have a real friendship form and a collaboration, and to be proud of the film is obviously a nice thing as well, and that they enjoyed it as well.
The film is How to Build a Time Machine by Jay Cheel.
And what was your place in that?
I'm one of two subjects in the film. The film talks about time travel, and it talks about obsession and the intersection between science and art. You know, I've been to several screenings, and it's interesting. There are different audiences. Tonight's audience naturally was a little more predisposed to the science aspect of it. There were people that were very interested in science. I've been to other screenings where people were more interested in the aspects of filmmaking, and so Jay was really the focus of their interest. This particular screening, it was clearly aimed at the science aspect of it. I thought that the questions were brilliant. I heard stuff tonight that I had not heard before at other festivals, at other screenings. And I've heard answers from Ron that I had never heard before. So for me, it was really interesting as well. You know, I had a conversation recently with somebody who
really is offended by the fact that Elon Musk was granted government funding. And my answer to that is, finally, my taxes are being put towards something that I can get behind. Instead of building weapons, instead of going around the world and getting involved in conflicts, let's get involved in innovation. That's what made, if we were ever great, if we were, you know, we won't argue that, it was because we were innovators. We've created technologies that have helped mankind across the globe, created jobs across the globe, improved economies. That's what we should be doing. It moves us forward. Social evolution is slow. We've been evolving since, you know, the first human was born. And it's fascinating to look at the path that we have taken. And now we know what we need to do. We need to use our heads, make our world better, and we can do that through investing in technologies, understanding more about the human brain. You know, you're using the word, inspire. I had no idea. When Jay asked me to be involved in this film, I thought, this will be fun. And in fact, he made, if you remember, he talked about this a little bit, he made a short film first. It was called Obsessed and Scientific. It was his thesis film for school. And at that time, I think it was, I don't remember the year it was, but it was several years before we started making How to Build a Time Machine. And at that time, Jay said to me, after we did, he interviewed me, he said, I want to do a feature with this at some point. And I remember thinking, is there really enough material here to do a feature? And so I really didn't know what to expect when he was making the film, and I'm extremely pleased with the result. And I just love the aspect of the intersection between science and art that's in it. But what do I hope for this film? When people come up to me and say that my work has inspired them and they want to do something now, I can't think of a better result than that. That makes me feel like it was worth it all the time. Yeah, it's the best.
A couple gentlemen said it on the way out today.
Yeah. I hear that at every screening, and I'm overwhelmed by it.
Lovely.
I thought that the audience was extremely responsive to the Gold Coast International Film Festival. In fact, they were one of the most lively audiences that I've had. And the questions that they had, I think, could have gone on all evening. I suggested to them that they might be interested in my book, Time Traveler, which actually goes into a little bit more detail about the process of time travel. But it was really a dynamic audience, and the theater was great. I mean, I loved seeing it projected on the big screen here. So I have to really thank the Gold Coast International Film Festival for having How to Build a Time Machine.